Hello, welcome to another episode of Flying High with Flutter. I'm your host, Alan Wyma, and today we have another manning guest on. We have Adrienne Braganza Tacke. We only had a chance to practice that one very quick, so I apologize if I murdered that one. She's the author of a book called Looks Good to Me. Just the title of it alone was attractive to me because I think there's a lot to that meaning. Adrienne, if you don't mind, tell us a little bit more about who you are and a little bit more about the book.
Sure. Yes. No, very close. Yeah. As Alan said, my name is Adrienne Braganza Tacke, and I've been a software developer for the last 10 years or so. I'm currently in developer advocacy, which I fell accidentally into. And part of that accidental path was how I actually wrote this book. But my background is in .NET, so C Sharp and JavaScript before all of the frameworks, just vanilla JavaScript. And I've just been working in a lot of small to medium sized companies here in Las Vegas, which is where I'm based. I got into developer advocacy when I started speaking at conferences because I was at a conference and someone was giving a talk and they were terrible at it. And so I said, how do I actually just do this myself? Like, how do you become a speaker? And so that's what I did. I saw that you applied to conferences, and I did that, got accepted to seven my first time trying this out. And as I was fulfilling those conferences and giving those talks, MongoDB actually reached out to me and was like, hey, do you want to do this as a job? I didn't know that was a job at all. This was DevRel, my first time in DevRel. So that's how I switched into DevRel. And what I found out that through all the things that you do in DevRel, which could be creating demos or blogs or tutorials or speaking, I really like teaching. I like teaching other developers. I like breaking down concepts into things that would be fun or easier for others to understand. And that's kind of what led me to write this book. When Manning approached me and was like, if you could write about any topic at all, given your choice, what would it be? And I'm like, code reviews. Code reviews, because it's still unfortunately not done well. It's such a key part of the software development process, in my opinion. And yet I hear so many complaints about it. And even in my own experience, it's never the same. It's not always great. And so I just really wanted to write a comprehensive book that kind of talks to us about code reviews comprehensively. And so hopefully that's what I did with this book.
Yeah, I guess that's something that people never really think about the code reviews part, right? I'm not sure how many people are actually doing code reviews. For me, I started working on a project with just one other person. We've been committing just both to master branch. He's a little bit newer to
Mm.
the language and framework that I'm using, so for that one, I say, okay, let's for your branches, why don't we do something like that? We're doing a little bit more informal, right? I'm not actually making comments to online. I'm just kind of walking through his code and making edits and
Mm.
then committing back so that way he can learn, right? How important are code reviews, right? I mean, and what should we be expecting to get from a code review? Because I feel like there's much more to a code review than just, okay, this could be better and things like that. Like it's a place that you can learn and exchange ideas, right?
Absolutely. I like you'll see a lot in the book. I'll always say that depends. That depends on the team. That depends on the kind of project you're working on. That depends on a lot of different things. Like, what are your goals with code review? Is it to just share knowledge and transfer, what you've been doing on your little parts of the code base with each other and with the rest of the team? Then maybe the code review is built in a way that facilitates that. Is it done so that you actually try to look for bugs or try to catch things that might be caught by automated processes like linting or static analysis? Then maybe that's what you focus on in a code review. So, depending on what your goals are, a code review can do that for you if you build it in such a way. And of course, in the context of which I wrote this book, it's talking about code reviews among teams. And so anytime there's more than a few people involved, there's going to be lots of opinions, lots of different ways things think they should be done. And I think a lot more of the code review, at least for me in this book, focuses on how the team works together. Because like you said, sometimes some folks just kind of go, here's what you could do better, or here's what's wrong, or here's what I would change. And then, the original author who proposes changes will look at this and ideally address that feedback in a happy world. But developers are very opinionated, so sometimes they won't agree with the feedback, or they'll think, who is this person to tell me what to do with this part of the code? And so there's a lot of things that can go wrong in terms of that type of communication, especially when it comes to developers and the code that they write. So in an ideal world, we use a code review to kind of do a gut check on each other's code, and to make sure it passes muster, to make sure it can go along with the rest of the process, whether that's a CI/CD process that now follows, or if you're just going straight to production and deploying it. It's kind of like a self check for self developers to not only share what they've been working in and what's changed with the code, but to also make sure that it's safe enough to be deployed in the rest of your application.
Well, so what do you mean by safe enough? You mean like no bugs, or because there could be a lot more than just bugs, right? It could be format of something, breaking down a certain patterns, things like that. I mean, what kinds of things should we really be focusing on that you think are kind of like most important?
So I discussed this where, I'm not saying if you do a code review, everything's going to be perfect, right? I think in the context of a full CI/CD system, meaning you do all the checks that you can, you have proper integration tests, you have build checks that test that your code actually compiles and builds, that you have proper formatting and syntax. So when I say safe enough, again, that depends on the team. If you're working on something that's very secure laden, you're going to have extra stringent checks. Is it compliant? Is it making sure that public data is not being exposed? Are other pieces of input that may be taken from users not used in such a way, or is it not breaking any of the OWASP 10 principles? It could go that far, which we should all be doing, really, not just anybody that's doing a secure application. But then if you are just working on, say, like a side project from a hackathon, then maybe safe enough is just it's working, it's getting the job done, it's demonstrating what it is that you are saying it should be doing. So that level of strictness with what you may use a code review for will depend on what it is that you are building and what your team's standards are in terms of what that means, what safe or good enough means in order to deploy.
Now we talked a little bit more about what kind of things we should be expecting, safety. Um, you specifically addressed a specific part in your book. You talk about sucking or suck. Sorry, how do you put this in the right way? Team code reviews that suck, right? Do you mind to kind of dig a little bit more
Mhm.
into that, because I feel like we get more of those than we
Yeah.
imagine actually.
Definitely. So, one of the first things that actually made me write this book was the code reviews that are just crappy, that are really unnecessarily mean. So, one of the first code review that I had as a junior .NET developer was unnecessarily harsh. It was saying, "Oh, this is stupid. Why did you do it this way? This is unbelievably dumb. Did you not read the documentation?" They were all comments that were not really constructive. And even if I may have made a mistake and, was in the wrong, I would have been better served by getting some feedback I could actually use rather than just telling me how terrible it is. It's like, tell me why it's terrible. Why is my code so crappy? What did I do wrong? But instead of making me learn or using that as an opportunity to learn what I had done wrong and what I could do better, it just focused on how terrible of a job that I did. And I think a lot of developers resonate with this opinion or view of code reviews, that it's just this critiqueful process that we all have to go through. Some people, they handle it better, right? They have thick skin and they're like, sure, tell me, I'll be able to handle that and I'll fix it or whatever. But most people, especially when they take the time to really craft their code, work on it, and really propose changes that they feel they've done their best on, and to only have people, crap all over it, it's not a great feeling to say, oh, this is not right, or this is something that's not okay, or you missed something. But there's still a need to do that. I'm not saying that we need to all walk on eggshells around each other and say, oh, we're all great and that we're all doing great things. There is a need for constructive feedback. And so some of the ways that it can suck are when people are just unnecessarily mean like that. Other ways it can suck are if folks don't use, let's say, in a PR process, which is the way I talk about mostly in this book on how to do code reviews, if the PR changes often. So let's say you've been assigned a PR to review and you think this is the final state, right? You're getting into the mindset of reviewing this, but then the author makes a change. And then now you have to go back and review everything again because a lot of things have changed. And so you're in the middle of your view and you're almost done. And then yet another change happens. We call this I know there's a different term that means this another thing, stacking PRs, but this is another type where it's done so in such a way that those that are reviewing are like, how am I supposed to review this? Because the state of the code changes are ever evolving. I don't know what I'm actually reviewing. Then there are code reviews that are kind of the biased buddy system. So again, using PRs where, let's say you have a process where you need to have at least one other person review your code and approve your changes and not yourself, right? We try not to self approve our changes, at least in a professional working environment. So you notice that there's just these two buddies who seem to always approve each other's requests, and they always have their PRs quickly reviewed because they kind of just have each other's back. Well, that's not necessarily a terrible thing. PRs are still being reviewed. Where it gets bad is if it's only those two within the context of a larger team. And also, if there are other PRs that are open and they tend to ignore those and they just kind of work on each other's and can almost guarantee that they're going to be approved because they're, buddies or whatever, that's another way it can suck because now you build this resentment on the team that only these two are working with each other and really not the rest of the team. And then one last other portion, or one way that it can suck that is very common, is let's say there's a fire in production and obviously all hands are on deck. You just want to fix what's wrong right away. So sometimes whatever um, standards or whatever checks you have in place, like an approval, might go out the wayside because it's an emergency. You just need to deploy it and it just needs to be fixed. So maybe you skip the code review and maybe it's done this one time because it's a major emergency and everybody's okay with it. But then sometimes that evolves into people using an emergency as a precedent, or they misuse it. They almost abuse it to say, oh, instead of going through the code review, this is actually just an emergency. We need to push it right away. Let's just skip the code review. So taking advantage of situations like this rather than going through the normal process, that's another way that it can suck because why do you even have the process in place if you're just circumventing it every single time? So those are the ones that come to mind that I've definitely experienced myself and what other developers that I've spoken to have brought up. But you'll see a couple more in the book.
Yeah, I mean, going through your book, I've definitely noticed some stuff that was quite it happened to me quite recently because we had a very mixed team with some senior guys, some junior guys, and you'd see this mixture of basically most of what you mentioned in your book about this different styles and things like that. I do have one question though. Something that came to my mind is if you do have a good PR, you're saying a sucky way to review a PR is just saying, "Hey, it looks good to me," and then push it through. Like, then how should we review a PR that we actually think is pretty good? What do you recommend?
That's a great question. So yes, rubber stamping, just like barely even looking at it or not fulfilling our responsibility as reviewers, that's one way that it can suck. And just one part to that, because a lot of folks tend to forget that, is, as reviewers, we still have a responsibility to do a review. Like a lot of us think, myself included, earlier in my career was, well, I'm reviewing this PR, but if the developer has a bug in it or something is wrong later on, well, that's not my problem. That's not on me. It's the developer. The developer wrote the buggy code. But what I've realized now and what I advocate for in the book is that as reviewers and, trying to move towards this collective ownership of the code base, we really should be thinking, how did I miss that if something actually did go wrong and it went through our review? So I what I tend to say is, every review that you do, you don't need to leave a bunch of comments if you don't need to. If you have done a thorough review, thorough meaning you've looked at all of the files, you've checked all of the edge cases that you can think of, you don't see any nuanced pieces of code that only you might understand as a human. If you are lucky enough to have automatic checks in place and all of those have turned green, all the tests have passed, and you're not checking those yourself, then that is something that is at least the bare minimum that can say you've thoroughly read this code, you understand it, it makes sense, it works within the rest of the code base, and it tends to fit within the overall architecture of your entire system, then yeah, it's safe to say this looks great. And you don't need to further feedback or any other comment that you need to leave on there. But if it does, obviously, we talk about that later on, but leave feedback in a constructive manner. But for the most part, if you can say that you've done a diligent job of going through the code and that you can understand it, then I think it's okay to say looks good to me.
Okay. I was just thinking because before you mentioned, no, it's not very good, but now I understand more. It's like if you don't actually review it and you say it looks good to me and you kick it through, that's the real problem, right? Okay. That
Yes.
makes sense. What I usually do is I go through and sometimes if I see something like really good, then I'll just make a comment on a specific one, say, "Oh, this is good," or even say like,
Mm.
"Okay, for this one, you can also think about doing blah blah blah." So give them a chance to kind of think about what makes more sense. Sometimes they say, "Oh, actually, that's better," or "Oh, that's good to know for the future," things like that. Um,
Absolutely, and
yeah.
I encourage that too. Like, a lot of folks, that's one thing I do mention because, we think about code reviews as a critique, right? And so when you think about good comments or maybe a compliment, that's very rare. Or you think, "Oh, maybe I'm wasting this person's time." But that's the one place where I'll say, "No, like, actually do that." If you see something really novel or, you find you're trying to give some praise to a junior who's finally understanding some sort of foundational concept, like it's never too much to give a compliment. The one caveat I'll say to that is, if everything is great, if you're pointing every single thing out, then sure, that's going to be a lot more noisy. But if you find something really novel, something that's worth complimenting on, definitely do that. And to the other point that you made, where you're like, it would be better to do this, or you're just giving some more informational things rather than something they have to take action on. This is where something I call comment signals come into play, where you basically classify or tag your comments to say, if it says needs work, like this is absolutely a comment you need to work on, and it's not going to go through until you address it. For something you've said, my team used to use something called level up, which is an opportunity for improvement that you don't need to change it right now. The code can go through as is, but maybe consider opening another PR to make that improvement or to make something a little bit better. So, comment signals or classifying your comments is a way to distinguish what needs to be worked on and what doesn't, which is also very helpful for the author.
Now, in your book, you also talk a little bit more about pair and mob programming, right? I I heard before some people describe at least pair programming as a way of saying like, okay, if you do pair programming, you're basically getting code review and writing the code at the same time. So therefore, at the end, you don't really need to have a PR review, right? Is that something you believe in, or no?
No, and I very strongly believe that you're kind of just moving the feedback cycle a little bit to the front of the process. And what I mean by that is, let's say you're pair programming. Yes, you're going to get more iterative feedback. You're going to get that feedback a lot faster, and you're going to get it more synchronously, I would say, because you're working together right there, right? And It is true, you'll likely come up with a better solution because you're working with two heads more than one. And it is true, you are technically reviewing each other's code as you are writing it. Why I say it does not replace code reviews is because the same issues still stand. You just, when it comes to not doing code reviews at all, and that's you have the context and the decision making and all of that nuance now just stuck between two heads instead of one. So you now have two people who might now silo that knowledge between themselves if you don't have a place like a code review to possibly share it with the rest of the team. What also still stands are if the two of you have been working it for a while and you're in the weeds working together on it, it still benefits from having some fresh eyes look at it. So somebody else on the team taking a look, a third pair of eyes, a fourth pair of eyes to look at it without that context and to see if there's anything that stands out that might be obvious that may not have been while you two were working on it and were so deep into that part of the code base. And the last thing of why I think pair programming and even mob programming doesn't fully replace code reviews or can replace them is that code reviews also are a very good place to keep track of what is going on in your code base. So if anything, if there's no, and this is assuming you have no other record keeping function of what you're doing and why code bases are changing, this code review, doing it even after doing a pair programming session, fulfills that need. You'll document what exactly is changing in your code base, and you'll have an opportunity to get all of that information out from the pair. So while I don't say that, pair programming is not bad, definitely do it. It has its uses. I just don't think it can fully replace the code review for those reasons.
Now you talk about like third pair of eyes, fourth pair of eyes, etc., etc. I mean, doesn't mob programming help with that? Because if you could have tons of pairs of eyes looking at this all at the same time, no?
So mob programming. So yes, like you do have a lot more people as part of that session, right? So you do have those multiple eyes already looking there. In this scenario, um, I still think a code review is warranted, but this is where I say you don't need to have it as formal as, say, a code review that's done with just a pair programming session or, in a normal team where a single person is proposing changes. In the book, I talk about, you are getting all of those different eyes. And if you get the whole team to be working on it, depending on how large your team is, that might be cumbersome if it's like more than 5 people. But if you are able to knock out the knowledge sharing and the knowledge transfer during the mob session or ensemble session, then great. You have taken care of that during the session rather than doing it through the code review process. Um, at this point, by doing all of that in a mob programming session, you get all of those benefits. You can have multiple eyes look at it. You have the feedback much faster because you're all working on it at the same time. At that point, a smaller code review could be warranted, and that code review could just be everybody drops their knowledge in there to document it, or it could even just be okay to actually just approve it because everybody has worked on it and everybody has seen the code. So um, this book you'll see a lot. It's kind of like a what fits your team, like choose your own adventure style. It really depends on what your goals are and what you think works for your team. So if you are a team that does engage in a lot of mob programming and you write a lot of code that way, then maybe a bulk of this book is probably not relevant for you other than the parts about writing a descriptive PR and making sure that what you're keeping track of, because at this point it's just a record keeping function for you, has the information that you need so that when you look back on it, if you ever need to refer to it, it's actually helpful rather than just, blank or just the code changes.
Yeah, I'm also thinking to myself that there's also kind of like a two-way street in terms of when PRs are submitted, right? Because you talk a lot bit in your book about this, like, oh, I don't have the context to really understand what this PR is actually doing, so I can't really give good feedback. I'm actually guilty of that quite a lot because I do a lot of PR review, And when I get the PR, I don't really have any context. There's no like description written out, but just very brief title that I kind of sometimes can understand. And so I mostly just look at the form, like, okay, how is this thing written? And then I kind of let them figure out if this is actually going to work out okay. Um, so besides, I mean, we've been mostly talking about like on the reviewer side, how can they give a good PR? So can we talk some more about on the person? What's the other way? How would you say it? The author of the PR? How what's their kind of responsibility?
Yeah, so the author has a lot of responsibility. So a lot of us think, we write the code and we're done, right? We throw it over the fence, we wait for the reviewer to do their job, and like that's it. We don't think of any other responsibility other than that. But unfortunately, we do have a little bit more responsibility, at least to prepare the pull request to be useful and to actually be beneficial. So, first thing you can do is like be your own first reviewer. I don't know how many times I've seen things where there were small typos that are there, or um, answers to some questions that are not in the PR description themselves, or files that are not related to the changes are part of this PR, or files are missing that are needed there. And there are just lots of things that are not cleaned up and not ready for the reviewer to review. And so being your own first reviewer, really stepping into the shoes of the reviewer and saying, you know, anticipate what the questions are going to be. Like with what you've provided so far, with the PR that you have prepared, is it ready? Are there any outstanding questions that you have? Are you able to answer any of the questions you anticipate the reviewer having by what you have? And are you also making sure you're answering that objectively by what's only in the PR, or are you filling in the gaps with the nuance and extra decision making that's in your head because it's fresh in your mind at the moment? So taking just a step back to just, I don't know about you, but anytime I write an email, I like double, triple, quadruple check it and read it because I want to make sure it has everything. I want to make sure it has files attached. I want to make sure dates are correct. If I'm talking about dates and planning, I want to make sure the person's name is spelled correctly. I want to make sure that that email is as ready to go and is ready for the person to receive, to read it, and just be on the same page, be clear what it is that I am trying to talk to them about. So, in the same way, if an author does everything they can to prepare that PR to be as context filled as, you know, uh, really just imagine you're about to go on vacation and you're about to submit this PR. Like you want it to be so filled with context and information that they can review it without having to call you during vacation. That's how great you want it. And how you do that, I talk about that in the book, but it comes with make sure you have a concise title, make sure you link any related issues or bug that are in your tracking software to the code that you are writing if it's relevant. Use labels or tags if they're relevant, and put down all of the resulting or relevant documentation if there are any as part of your PR. Like make it so context filled that they cannot question it. That's the one thing that we could probably do better. And then aside from that, I think one thing that we tend to forget as authors is to kind of um, not take feedback personally. So I alluded to this earlier, but a lot of developers when they send up their code, they're like it's their baby, right? They've worked on this. It's as perfect as could be. They've tested it. They've thought about all of the edge cases, presumably, and like they are expecting it to just be approved because there's nothing wrong with it. They've worked so hard on it. But anytime there is feedback and it's written in a constructive way and it's valid feedback, there are some developers that get offended by it or are in disbelief that anything could be needed to be addressed or could be improved. So just as we ask the reviewer to kind of take ego out of the question and you know use that excuse of like, well, my way is better than your implementation. We should do the same thing as authors. We should take ego out of it and keep it focused on the code. So if you do receive feedback, don't immediately get attacked by it or don't feel hurt by it. Just look at it as an opportunity to improve your code, especially if it is actually valid and constructively written feedback.
A couple things came up when you were talking in there. I think the first one that came up in my mind is what I do see is because I've been committing a lot to these open source projects is most of them have like a checklist, like as a template. Do you
Hmm.
think that's a good thing to have to kind of speed along the process?
Absolutely. That's one of the tactics I do share is using PR templates because, we are asking you to be so filled with context and to make sure you have everything that the reviewer might need. And especially in open source projects, like it's almost impossible to manage the contributions and to get through them and to go through the valid ones that actually took the time and spent some effort on it without having something like PR templates. So, if you want to maintain a standard with your code base and you want to be able to review the code in a systematic way, then it's absolutely needed to have some structure. If you're sending in a potential bug fix, um, you would want to know certain things like what did you do to reproduce the bug? How did you make sure that this fix actually solves the issue? What are the potential impacts to the rest of the code base that might be introduced with your fix? These are the types of things that you might ask for in your template, meaning when you open a PR and you say that it is a bug fix that you would ask for. This is different for, say, a new feature. If you are proposing a new feature, especially if it's in an open source project, you want to know different things. Why is this needed? Is this not covered by some other issue or not currently being worked on? Did you add unit tests and integration tests if applicable? There are different sets of things and different sets of information that you might ask authors to give you depending on the type of code changes that you are being sent. So this is a lot more prominent in open source projects. I'm sure you've seen those templates are absolutely there because a lot of open source maintainers, they tell me they won't even look at your PR if it doesn't follow the template that they've laid out. That's how they filter out either bad contributions or just contributions they won't even consider because they didn't take the time to read the instructions, right? And then for closed source projects or anybody that's working in private teams and companies, it's still a good thing to have, using something like a PR template because that helps take away the mental load of authors having to remember what do I need to put in here again. It's more like a template that you just fill out, and it encourages authors to make sure that the information is there. And a little bit later, the last chapter I have is about AI tools, and that a lot of AI tools, those that's a great place where AI can help is something as like that, writing descriptions or summarizing things. That's where we can definitely use AI to help in code reviews.
Okay, yeah, that's something that came up in my mind, but we can get to that a little bit later on. Now, the other thing that came up in my mind, and actually I experienced quite a bit, is some developers, maybe even me sometimes, can be very, like you said before, very opinionated and want things to be done a certain way. They may agree, disagree. If you do get into this kind of comment war, or, where it's like you just saying, okay, I think this one, no, I don't agree. How do you recommend best to kind of um, handle this kind of situation? Because it could be quite difficult with some people, right?
Definitely. This happens all the time. And some of the things I suggest are, let's say you are starting down this thread where, you leave some feedback and then the author's like, well, no, that's actually not necessary because of XYZ. And then you go, well, no, this is actually what I meant and this is why it is needed. If you're going down already like two or three back and forths with the author asynchronously through comments, that's a sign to just actually try to talk to them like synchronously, whether that's in person, tap them on the shoulder and just be like, all right, let's just hash this out right now because we're obviously not on the same page. This is not working via online comments. And if you have to, the person you're talking to has to be remote, then get on a video call, when you can, to talk this out. And what happens is by being on this call or talking to them synchronously, you are able to get your ideas a little bit better presented. You're missing body language, you're missing tone, and you're missing the immediate responses that you might have to somebody versus waiting for it, having somebody write it out. And the other part too is sometimes people can better explain their side of it by just talking it out loud. Sometimes they themselves understand it or are seeing the other side just by talking it out loud. It's a different set of neurons we're firing rather than just trying to type it out or write it out. The other suggestion that I give is, let's say, this is still an argument of somebody says, this implementation is better because of XYZ, and then someone says, no, this implementation is actually better, and they also use, let's say, the standard of clarity or being able to understand the code. That's a very common thing where people are like, that's a very common standard for most teams is code needs to be legible. It needs to be understood by the whole team, not just one person. And so you get into these debates of two developers saying my way is more understandable because somebody values variable naming and somebody else values the order of how a file looks. Well, in those cases, I always ask them to try to first talk and ask each other, why? Where are you coming from? Why do you think yours is more legible, or why do you think yours is more clear? And then have your explanations said at the same time. And what tends to work out is actually just doing a pair programming session with the person that you're disagreeing with, because then you're kind of forcing the two to find an even better solution. Do you maybe combine parts of the solutions that you've both implemented, or you are, as in the middle of doing pair programming, you're able to see where the other person is coming from and maybe compromise a bit and say, okay, this actually does make sense with what you're trying to say. If that still doesn't work and you still are getting stuck, and then the last resort that I say is to bring in some, again, fresh eyes, and maybe the rest of your team members, if you can, or other external party, to kind of settle the debate and say which one is more legible to you. Because right now you're both just claiming that your own implementation is better, but that's based on your standards and what you think is clear. So if you're able to get again that fresh set of eyes to objectively say, this is the implementation I think is better because it's more understandable to me, or even have them become part of like a mob programming session and then you all figure out a new solution. Those are some ways to kind of get out of those debates and never ending arguments and try to actually get to a solution so that you can move forward with the process.
There's some very good points. What else you mentioned in the book, and I think that definitely also resonates a lot too, is one thing that we found at the beginning of working on a specific project that comes to mind is that actually when we had a small team, things were okay. We brought in some outside contractors to help with some more difficult parts of the code, and that's when things started to get a little bit awry, right? It's like things were happening and code was there and nobody could really understand it. And the way we managed to solve that was actually by writing like a code. I forget what the heck we call that one, but basically saying like, okay, if you do this, then it should be like that. Like class name should be like camel case and etc. These kind of coding rules, coding guideline. That's what we called it. Um, you mentioned in your book actually something similar for uh, PRs, right? It's what's it called again? The team working agreement. Is that right?
Yep. Spot on. Yes. This is so crucial that it's like one of the first early chapters that I talk about because for the reason that you explained, it could be very invaluable to your team. So, um, just settling on what your code standards are as a team can be super helpful in so many different ways. So, if you have a style guide and formatting and linting rules that you have developed as a team, you can now codify that and you can automate that away. Like you don't need to fight about that in a code review. You can literally run those checks automatically before you even open the PR. So fix that while you are developing and make sure that is not ever talked about again. It's just unnecessary in code reviews. Now, if you have similar rules, which may not be enforced automatically like that, but similar rules, as in what constitutes an issue that is blocking, meaning it needs to be addressed before it can be approved and can progress through the rest of the code review, what issues are blocking for your team versus non-blocking. A lot of blocking issues are things like security or things like legibility or things like duplicated code. There are lots of examples that teams try to pull out and put into these sections that says, here is an example, so it's a bit more clear, of an issue that would not pass, and you are allowed as a reviewer to block on. You can say this needs to be fixed before it goes through. And at the same time, for those who are very nitpicky, you can also have the list of non-blocking. So you can say these are things that you are not allowed to block my PR on. That's just purely subjective or preferential, or things that don't really affect the code base health overall. And so it is safe to progress through the code base without it being addressed. So, non blocking versus blocking issues is one thing that you could put in your team working agreement. Another is, what is your actual code review process? Because a lot of times you ask your team, you get a different answer, or you get a very abridged version from one person and you get a super detailed version from another. And then you have someone that has missing steps. So, getting onto the same page about it and just again documenting it and saying, here's the process and here's the expectations of what the reviewer is supposed to do, what the author is supposed to do. Having all of these expectations, these are really implicit expectations that we all have as a team, that we just expect each other to know and expect each other to follow when we're on a team and we're doing the code review. But when they're not met or they're not followed, or people have different levels of what those expectations are, that's where the friction comes in. That's where people start not liking the code review because it's done in a different way, or somebody is not doing the code review to the standard that everybody is assuming it is done to. So agreeing as a team on what the code review process is like, what the expectations are, what your blocking versus non blocking issues are. These are the types of things that once you figure them out, and I'm not saying that that's easy, right? Sometimes, a lot of the times, communicating with your team and just getting to a decision you all agree on, that's the hardest part. But the faster that you can have those conversations and get to those agreements, the faster that you can come to these guidelines, these standards that you can now enforce as a team. And having that is invaluable. Having it is invaluable because if you use it as an objective reasoning in your feedback as a reviewer, for example, that's now, coming from a place of objectivity rather than the reviewer just giving you that feedback and you thinking it's just them giving their personal opinion. And again, in the case that you just brought up, where you have to work with external teams or consultants, it's even more imperative to have these standards, because it's very common to have consultants or other external teams not follow the guidelines or standards of your code base, and that's where it starts to drift. That's where it starts to get messy, and that's where it starts to not look cohesive. So being able to have those standards now enables you to say, nope, We can, do a gate check by having PRs. And if it doesn't match the rest of our code base standards, then again, you're coming from an objective place of blocking any code that doesn't match the rest of your code base rather than possibly having a harder time arguing from having no standards. Your negotiation position on that is a little bit harder if you don't have such documented standards that you could point to. So, team working agreement, it's great. Everybody should have one on their team.
Yeah, I used to think that these kinds of things were stupid until actually it came up. We followed it, and then and everybody violated it. Or that sounds kind of negative, but if you saw that something was not following the guideline, then you would say, "Hey, look at this," and then it kind of helps to quell some of these problems. But of course, there's always some times where it's like, well, in this case, it actually makes it better if we don't follow this because maybe it's easier to read or whatever. So there's always some kind of situations where that doesn't always apply, but most of the time it works out pretty well. And also, like, it's also not set in stone too, right? You could always make adjustments over time when you find out things that work better for you, right?
Exactly. Yeah, I point that out that this is not like some law that once you've written your first set of standards or your first team working agreement that this is it. Like you have to follow it from now until everybody, leaves. It's an evolving document. So you never know. Something that you put into place now might be something that doesn't work for your team and you find that it's actually a guideline that you don't want to follow anymore because it doesn't suit your team. Other times you go through like the reality of working through a project or working with a specific client, or there are lots of quirks to how you work on a team and the projects that you work on. So sometimes there are things that are guidelines that are missing that you might have to add. So it definitely is something that should evolve with the team and evolve with how the team works and how the team grows. Like one thing I mentioned there is, let's say you're a team of all seniors, you've all known each other, and you know how you know how each other works, you trust each other. Your code review may not need to be so strict. It may not need to have as many checks. On the other hand, if you have a lot of new team members or you have some junior or mid levels who may not be as well versed as a few seniors on the team, then maybe you have a bit more uh, checks in place and maybe you have a bit more of a stringent code review. It all depends on your team and how your team works and how they evolve. So the team working agreement should definitely change with your team.
Some good points. Yeah, I don't think I have anything else. I think your book probably goes to much better detail than we can go on here, or else people would never buy your book because we talk about everything in there. Um,
Sure, sure.
do you have any, like, maybe some parting thoughts we could have before we start to wrap up? Because I feel like I said, I think we've asked quite a bit, and then there's definitely a lot of detail in there. You keep saying refer back, refer back. Well, okay, maybe I better just crack it open and read the whole thing from cover to cover, right, and make sure I get all the information in.
Yeah, I do say that. I spent 2 years writing this book right here. So when I say that it's a labor of love, it definitely is. And the great thing about this is, I want this to be a reference. So maybe you may not need this right now, but if you switch teams, you can definitely refer back to different chapters that might be relevant for you at that time with that specific team. So yes, definitely check it out. Please, I love to hear your thoughts and experiences on if you've actually implemented something from my book. That would be great. And I guess the last parting words that I'll give is that code reviews are super super needed. Like they're still key to software development, and especially now in the age of AI, and as we are writing or pretty much generating a lot more code with AI, it's even more imperative that we use our critical thinking skills to do code reviews and to do them well and to do them by humans. So definitely check the book out. And if you are interested at all or care at all about code reviews, it's definitely going to be a page turner for you.
Yeah, it definitely rings some. As I said, just the title of it really attracted me. I said, "Oh, I need to get her on the show because this is much more important than people realize." Um, yeah. So for the book, we should have a specific discount code that we should include into the show notes when we actually release this episode. And so, yeah, other than that, Adrienne, it's good to have you on, and maybe we'll have you back on again. I don't know. What would be your next book if you were to actually write another one?
Ooh, that's a good question. I would probably write a book on variable naming. That's the other thing I really like to talk about.
Yeah, that's that's very tricky. I'm not sure how that one could be more objective than anything else. That's very tricky, and also it's language
That
dependent
one would
too.
absolutely, but I think yeah, that would cause some flame wars on the internet for sure. But I don't know. I like topics like that where it's basic but applies to like most software developers. So
Yeah,
I don't know. That's what comes to mind in the moment. But I don't know if I'm going to be writing any books anytime soon. I'm going to take a break from this one.
I could imagine. Well, it was great to have you on. Excellent book. It's called "Looks Good to Me." A phrase that now seems to have some daggers in my heart when I think about it after reading through your book a bit. So I'm sure the same for you, right? So well,
Absolutely. Yeah, no, this is great. Thank you for having me, Alan.
thanks for coming on.